The moment your spouse tells you that another man will always come before your feelings, the marriage doesn't end all at once. It ends one quiet piece at a time. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 42 years old, born and raised in Colorado, and for most of my adult life, I believed that trust was stronger than jealousy. I believed that if two people loved each other enough, they could survive almost anything. Looking back now, I realize how dangerous that belief can be when only one person is protecting the marriage. The night everything changed wasn't dramatic. There were no slammed doors, no shouting, no shocking confession, just a Tuesday evening in late October. The kind of evening where the sun disappears before 6 o'clock and the air outside carries the first hint of winter. I came home from work a little after 7. My logistics company had been dealing with delays all week, and all I wanted was a hot meal, a shower, and a quiet night with my wife. The house looked normal. The porch light was on. Rebecca's car sat in the driveway. Through the front window, I could see the soft glow of the kitchen lights. Normal. Safe. Familiar. Funny how betrayal almost always hides behind ordinary moments. I stepped inside and immediately heard laughter coming from the kitchen. Rebecca was standing by the counter with her phone pressed against her ear. She didn't notice me at first. Her smile was different. Lighter. Younger somehow. The kind of smile I hadn't seen directed at me in a very long time. When she finally saw me, she ended the call quickly. Too quickly. Hey, she said. You're home early. I glanced at the phone in her hand. Who was that? Her answer came without hesitation. Jason. That name again. Jason Miller. Her college boyfriend. The man who somehow never completely disappeared from our lives. I nodded and set my keys on the counter. You talked to him a lot lately. She shrugged. We're friends. Friends. Such a simple word. Such a useful word. Over the years, I had heard it hundreds of times. Every dinner invitation. Every phone call. Every unexpected coffee meeting. Every conversation that somehow included his name. Friends. At first, I believed it. Then I tolerated it. Eventually, I learned to stay silent about it because every discussion ended exactly the same way. With me being told I was insecure. That night, though, something felt different. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I was finally paying attention. Or maybe some part of me already knew what was coming. Rebecca poured herself a glass of sparkling water and leaned against the kitchen island. Jason invited me to a charity event next month, she said casually. I told him I'd go. I looked up. You already agreed? Of course. Without talking to me. Her expression hardened immediately. Not angry. Annoyed. Like I had interrupted something. Why would I need permission? I didn't say permission. Then what are you saying? The room suddenly felt smaller. The refrigerator hummed in the background. The clock above the stove ticked quietly. Ordinary sounds that somehow seemed louder than before. I took a slow breath. I'm saying it feels like Jason gets a vote in our marriage, and I don't. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. Rebecca stared at me. Then she laughed. Not cruelly. Not loudly. Just enough to make me feel ridiculous for speaking. Ethan, this again, she said. He's been part of my life for over 20 years. I nodded slowly. And I'm your husband. That's when she said it. The sentence that would replay in my head for months afterward. The sentence that changed everything. She crossed her arms and looked directly at me. You can't stop me from seeing my ex anytime I want. He's an integral part of my life. The words landed with surprising force. Not because she was seeing him. Not because she defended him. But because of how easily she said it. No hesitation. No concern about how it sounded. No recognition that she was talking to the man she married. In that moment, I realized something I should have understood years earlier. Jason wasn't the problem. The problem was that Rebecca genuinely believed I should accept whatever role she chose to give me. I stood there quietly while she returned to scrolling through her phone. The conversation was already over in her mind. But something inside me had shifted. Not anger. Not jealousy. Something colder. Clearer. For the first time in years, I stopped trying to convince her to choose our marriage first. I stopped trying to explain why boundaries matter. I stopped trying to compete with a ghost from her past. Because standing in that kitchen, listening to the woman I loved defend another man with absolute certainty, I finally understood a truth I had been avoiding for far too long. And what Rebecca didn't know was that I had already discovered something about Jason months earlier. Something that would make her confidence look very different before this story was over. What Rebecca did not know was that my doubts about Jason had started long before that conversation in the kitchen. Nearly 8 months earlier, I had been sitting in a hotel lobby outside Phoenix waiting for a delayed meeting with a potential client. It was one of those quiet weekday afternoons when business travelers drift in and out carrying laptops and paper coffee cups, each person focused on their own destination. I remember looking down at my phone, catching up on emails, when I heard a familiar name from a nearby table. Jason Miller. At first I assumed it was a coincidence. There are thousands of men named Jason Miller in America. But then I heard another detail. The man speaking mentioned the university Rebecca and Jason had attended together. That got my attention. I did not stare. I did not interrupt. I simply listened. Two men in their 40s were having what sounded like a casual conversation. One of them was Jason. I recognized him immediately after glancing up. He looked older than the last time I had seen him, a little more tired around the eyes, but it was definitely him. What surprised me was not what he said. It was what he did not say. When his friend jokingly asked whether he had ever regretted letting Rebecca get away, Jason laughed softly and shook his head. That story is ancient history, he said. People think I am still hung up on her. I am not. The conversation moved on, but those words stayed with me. People think I am still hung up on her. I remember feeling confused. Because according to Rebecca, their friendship was built on a deep mutual connection that neither of them wanted to lose. Yet Jason sounded like a man discussing a chapter that had ended years ago. I should have forgotten about it. I should have gone back to my meeting and never thought about it again. Instead, curiosity settled into the back of my mind like a pebble inside a shoe. Small, easy to ignore, impossible to completely forget. Over the following months, I started noticing things I had previously dismissed. Rebecca was always the one initiating contact. If Jason texted, she responded immediately. If he did not text for a few days, she found a reason to reach out first. Birthdays, work milestones, random memories from college. Any excuse seemed sufficient. Once you begin paying attention, patterns reveal themselves. Another thing stood out. Jason rarely invited her anywhere alone. Most of the events she attended involved groups of people. Former classmates, charity boards, networking functions. Yet Rebecca constantly described their relationship as though it occupied a central place in both their lives. The facts did not match the narrative. One Saturday morning, I found her scrolling through old photographs while drinking coffee in the living room. Hundreds of images from 20 years ago. Football games, road trips, graduation parties. She smiled at the screen in a way I had not seen in years. Not because she was remembering a person, because she was remembering a version of herself. I understood that feeling. Everyone misses youth sometimes. Everyone misses simpler days. But what unsettled me was how fiercely she protected those memories whenever I asked about them. It was as if questioning Jason meant questioning an entire identity she refused to let go of. The more I observed, the more a different picture emerged. Not an affair. Not a secret romance. Something stranger. Rebecca seemed emotionally anchored to a past that no longer existed. Jason had become less of a person and more of a symbol. A living reminder of who she used to be. The realization hit me hardest one evening after a company dinner. We were driving home through light rain, windshield wipers moving steadily across the glass. Out of nowhere she said, "Do you ever wonder what life would have looked like if you had made different choices?" I thought about it for a moment. Sometimes, I answered, but I am pretty happy with the choices I made. She stared out the passenger window. I wonder all the time. At the time, I let the comment pass. Looking back, I should have paid closer attention. Because people who are fully present in their lives do not spend every day looking backward. They build forward. They invest forward. They dream forward. Rebecca seemed trapped between two timelines. The life she had and the life she imagined she might have had. And somewhere in the middle stood Jason. The man she insisted was still essential. The man she believed would always be part of her story. What she did not realize was that I had already learned something else about him as well. Something that would completely change the way I viewed everything she had been telling herself for years. The second thing I learned about Jason came completely by accident. About 3 months before that conversation in the kitchen, I attended a regional business conference in Denver. It was not the kind of event anyone gets excited about. 3 days of presentations, networking sessions, hotel coffee, and conversations about supply chains. Most people showed up, exchanged business cards, and forgot each other's names a week later. On the second afternoon, I found myself sitting beside a man named Michael Turner during a panel discussion. We started talking during a break. Nothing unusual. He worked in commercial real estate. I owned a logistics company. Two middle-aged professionals making small talk while waiting for the next speaker. Then he mentioned volunteering for a nonprofit board. One thing led to another, and eventually he brought up a mutual contact. Jason Miller. I kept my expression neutral. You know Jason? I asked. Michael laughed. Everybody knows Jason. There was something in the way he said it that caught my attention. Not admiration. Not resentment. Just familiarity. The way people talk about someone they have known for years. We spent the next 10 minutes discussing various people from the local business community. Jason's name surfaced a few more times. Each time, Michael described him the same way. Reliable. Professional. Friendly. Focused on work. Then he casually mentioned something that made me pause. His girlfriend seems great too. I remember blinking. His girlfriend? Michael nodded. Yeah. They have been together for a while now. Maybe 4 years. 5. I lose track. The conference room suddenly felt very quiet. Not because anything dramatic happened. Because a puzzle piece had quietly slid into place. Rebecca talked about Jason constantly. She spoke as though he remained emotionally connected to her life in some profound way. Yet here was someone who saw him regularly describing a completely different reality. Jason had built an entire life that did not revolve around Rebecca. He had a long-term relationship, shared responsibilities, future plans. The conversation moved on, but my thoughts stayed there. During the flight home, I stared out the airplane window as the Rocky Mountains disappeared beneath the clouds. Something about the situation finally made sense. Rebecca was not competing with another woman. She was competing with time. She was holding on to a version of Jason that no longer existed. A memory, an idea, a possibility. The actual man had continued moving forward years ago. That realization should have comforted me. Instead, it left me unsettled. Because if Jason was not encouraging this attachment, then why was Rebecca investing so much emotional energy into it? Why was she defending him so fiercely? Why did every disagreement somehow end with his importance being reaffirmed? Over the following weeks, I paid closer attention. Not to her phone, not to her messages, to her behavior. There is a difference. One Friday evening, we attended a fundraising gala downtown. The ballroom overlooked the city skyline. Glass walls reflected hundreds of tiny lights stretching across the darkness. Rebecca spent half the evening talking about whether Jason would attend. He never showed up. Yet somehow he remained the most discussed person in the room. During dinner, she mentioned him twice. During dessert, she brought him up again. Driving home, she wondered aloud why he had skipped the event. I remember gripping the steering wheel and realizing something uncomfortable. For hours, she had barely asked me a single question. Not about my week. Not about my company. Not about anything happening. The message arrived at 1:13 in the morning. I remember the exact time because I was still awake. Sleep had become harder to find in those months. Not because of work. Not because of money. Because there is a certain kind of uncertainty that settles into a house long before any major decision is made. You feel it in the silence. You notice it in the empty spaces between conversations. That night, rain tapped softly against the bedroom window while the digital clock on my nightstand glowed blue in the darkness. Rebecca was asleep beside me. At least I thought she was. Then her phone lit up. The screen illuminated the room for only a second before fading, but it was enough. Jason. His name appeared clearly across the display. I did not touch the phone. I did not pick it up. I did not read the message. But I saw the name. And then I saw something else. Rebecca opened her eyes almost immediately. Not gradually. Not the way someone wakes naturally. She was already alert. Within seconds, she reached for the phone, glanced at the screen, and slipped quietly out of bed. I lay there staring at the ceiling while her footsteps disappeared down the hallway. A few moments later, I heard the faint sound of the back door opening, then closing. The rain continued outside. I checked the clock again. 1:15 a.m. Most people do not step outside in the middle of the night to answer routine messages. That thought stayed with me as I listened to the distant hum of the furnace and the steady rhythm of water hitting the gutters. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Finally, I heard the door open again. Rebecca returned to bed and settled beneath the blankets without saying a word. Her breathing gradually slowed. Mine did not. The next morning, she acted as though nothing unusual had happened. Coffee, morning news, work schedules, the familiar routine we had followed for years. I watched her move around the kitchen while sunlight spilled across the countertops. She looked perfectly comfortable, perfectly normal. Eventually, I asked a simple question. Everything okay last night? She looked up from her coffee mug. What do you mean? You stepped outside after midnight. Her expression barely changed. Oh, Jason had a question about a charity project. I nodded. At 1 in the morning? She shrugged. He keeps weird hours sometimes. Then she changed the subject. The explanation was not impossible. It was simply unsatisfying. More importantly, it felt rehearsed. That afternoon, I tried to focus on work, but my thoughts kept returning to the same question. Why did she need privacy for a conversation that was supposedly harmless? The following week brought more small moments. Individually, they meant very little. Together, they painted a picture that became harder to ignore. Rebecca smiled more often when checking her phone than she did during conversations at home. She became increasingly distracted during dinner. Sometimes she would drift away mentally in the middle of a discussion and then ask me to repeat what I had just said. One evening, I talked for nearly 5 minutes about a potential expansion opportunity for my company. When I finished, she blinked and said, "Sorry, what was that?" Yet somehow she never seemed distracted when Jason's name appeared. That contrast stayed with me. Then came the weekend that changed everything. We attended a neighborhood barbecue hosted by friends who lived 3 streets away. It was the kind of gathering that defines suburban life. Folding chairs, children playing in backyards, the smell of grilled food drifting through cool autumn air. Everyone talking about sports, vacations, and work. At one point, a woman asked Rebecca how long she and I had been married. 12 years, Rebecca answered. The woman smiled. That is wonderful. What is the secret? Rebecca laughed. Most people would have answered with something simple. Communication, trust, patience. Instead, she said something that caught me completely off guard. Never forget who you were before the marriage. Everyone chuckled and moved on. The conversation continued. But those words stayed with me. Because I suddenly understood something I had been missing. Rebecca was not protecting a friendship. She was protecting a version of herself that existed before our life together began. Jason simply happened to be connected to that version. And once I saw that truth, every strange interaction, every late-night message, every emotional defense started fitting together in a way I could no longer ignore. What I did not realize yet was that within a few days I would finally stop wondering whether I was imagining things and begin searching for answers I was not sure I wanted to find. The following Thursday gave me an opportunity one had not been looking for. Rebecca told me she would be attending a planning meeting for the same charity project she had mentioned after that late-night message. Normally, I would not have thought twice about it. People attend meetings. People volunteer. People stay busy. But something about the timing bothered me. Maybe it was the conversation in the kitchen. Maybe it was the growing distance between us. Or maybe it was simply the accumulation of dozens of small moments that no longer fit together the way they once had. I did not decide to follow her because I expected to uncover some dramatic secret. The truth is far less exciting. I wanted clarity. I wanted to know whether my instincts were warning me about something real or whether months of doubt had simply distorted my perspective. That evening, Rebecca left the house around 6 o'clock. She looked unusually cheerful, the kind of mood that seems effortless. She grabbed her purse, kissed my cheek, and headed for the door. "Do not wait up," she said with a smile. The meeting could run late. I nodded and watched her drive away. 20 minutes later, I found myself sitting in my truck several blocks from the community center where the event was supposedly being held. The parking lot was half full. Families came and went. Volunteers carried boxes through the front entrance. Everything appeared completely normal. Rebecca's car was there. For a moment, I felt ridiculous. Maybe this was exactly what it looked like. Maybe I was becoming the suspicious husband she always accused me of being. Then, something unexpected happened. Rebecca walked out of the building less than 15 minutes after arriving. She was not carrying papers. She was not talking with volunteers. She simply got into her car and drove away. My stomach tightened. I waited several seconds before pulling out behind her. The sun had already disappeared, leaving the streets covered in soft amber light from storefronts and traffic signals. Rebecca drove across town toward an older section of the city filled with restaurants and small businesses. Eventually, she parked outside a quiet coffee shop. I remained across the street where I could see the entrance without drawing attention to myself. 5 minutes later, another vehicle arrived. Jason stepped out. I recognized him immediately. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. Not from anger. From anticipation. For months I had wondered what their dynamic actually looked like when nobody else was around. Here was my chance to find out. They entered the coffee shop together and took seats near a front window. I expected flirtation, secretive behavior, something that would justify every fear I had carried. Instead, I witnessed something completely different. Rebecca did almost all the talking. Even through the glass, it was obvious. She leaned forward. She smiled constantly. She seemed energized in a way I had not seen at home in years. Jason listened politely. Occasionally he nodded. Sometimes he glanced at his watch. Several times he looked distracted. At one point, he even checked his phone while Rebecca continued speaking. The interaction felt strangely unbalanced. I sat there for nearly 40 minutes observing them. The more I watched, the more confused I became. Because the person who appeared emotionally invested was not Jason. It was Rebecca. He looked friendly, respectful, comfortable, but not captivated, not emotionally dependent, not obsessed. The dynamic I had imagined simply was not there. Eventually, they stood and walked outside. That was when I noticed something that changed everything. Jason showed Rebecca a photograph on his phone. She smiled politely. He pointed at the screen again. Even from a distance, I could see the expression on his face. Pride. Genuine happiness. A few moments later, he hugged her briefly and headed toward his vehicle. Rebecca remained standing beside her car long after he left. Alone, watching taillights disappear into traffic. There was something heartbreaking about the image. Not because of betrayal, because of longing. For the first time, I realized she might not be holding on to a man. She might be holding on to a fantasy. A life she had imagined years ago and never completely released. I drove home before she did. When she walked through the front door later that evening, she looked tired, quiet, almost disappointed. She asked how my night had been. I said it was fine. Then we sat together in the living room while the television played softly in the background. Neither of us said much. But as I watched her stare absently toward the screen, one thought kept repeating in my head. Jason was not the person I should have been worried about. The real problem was something far more complicated, and I was only beginning to understand it. After that night, I stopped looking for evidence and started looking for truth. There is a difference. Evidence is something you collect when you are trying to prove a theory. Truth is what remains when you are finally willing to let the theory go. For months, I had convinced myself that Jason was the center of the problem. The late-night messages, the constant conversations, the emotional energy Rebecca poured into that connection. Everything seemed to point toward him. But sitting in my truck outside that coffee shop had changed something. I had seen enough to understand that the story was more complicated than I wanted it to be. Over the next few weeks, I became quieter. Not cold, not hostile, just observant. I stopped arguing whenever Jason's name came up. I stopped asking questions that I already knew would lead nowhere. Surprisingly, Rebecca seemed relieved. It was almost as if she had spent years preparing defenses for battles that no longer existed. One Sunday afternoon, we were cleaning out the garage before winter. The air smelled like fallen leaves and fresh-cut lumber from a nearby construction project. Sunlight streamed through the open garage door while old boxes sat stacked around us. At one point, Rebecca found a photo album buried beneath holiday decorations. She sat down on a folding chair and started flipping through the pages. College pictures, road trips, graduation ceremonies, faces from another lifetime. I watched her expression change. Her shoulders relaxed. Her eyes softened. For nearly 20 minutes, she barely spoke. Finally, she stopped on a photograph and stared at it. "Those were good years," she said quietly. "The best years." I asked. The question slipped out before I could stop it. She hesitated. Not for long. Just long enough. "Sometimes I think they might have been." Then she returned to the album. The answer hurt more than I expected. Not because she had enjoyed her youth. Everyone does. It hurt because she said it while sitting inside a life we had spent 12 years building together. A marriage. A home. A future. Yet somehow none of it seemed capable of competing with memories frozen inside old photographs. That evening, I sat alone on the back patio long after sunset. The neighborhood was quiet except for distant traffic and the occasional bark of a dog somewhere down the street. I thought about the notebook I had found months earlier, the goals I had accomplished, the businesses I had built, the friendships that had evolved over time. Life moves forward. That is its nature. Every meaningful chapter requires leaving another chapter behind. Rebecca seemed unable to do that. The more I reflected on it, the more one realization became impossible to ignore. She was not in love with Jason. She was in love with possibility. The possibility of a different path, a different future, a different version of herself. Jason simply represented the road she never took. Once that idea settled into place, everything began making sense. Her emotional reactions, her defensiveness, her refusal to establish boundaries. None of it was really about him. It was about protecting a fantasy she had spent years nurturing. The problem with fantasies is that reality can never compete with them. Reality has bills, responsibilities, ordinary routines. Fantasy only has imagination. A few days later, another piece of the puzzle arrived unexpectedly. I was having lunch with a supplier when I received a message from an unfamiliar number. Normally, I ignore unknown texts. For some reason, I opened this one. The message was brief. "This is Sarah, Jason's partner. We met once at a charity event 2 years ago. I hope this is not strange, but I think you should know something." My pulse immediately quickened. I stared at the screen for several seconds before reading the next message. What she told me over the following 10 minutes would confirm everything I had slowly begun to suspect. More importantly, it would reveal that Jason himself had been trying to create distance for much longer than I ever realized. For several minutes, I simply stared at my phone. The restaurant around me faded into background noise. Silverware clinked against plates. Conversations drifted through the room. Someone laughed near the bar. Yet all of it felt distant as I reread Sarah's message. Eventually, I replied, "What do you think I should know?" Her answer arrived almost immediately. "I'm not trying to cause problems. I just think you deserve context." Context. It was an interesting word. Not evidence. Not accusations. Context. Over the next hour, we exchanged a series of messages that painted a picture very different from the one I had imagined. According to Sarah, she and Jason had been together for nearly 5 years. They shared a home. They were discussing marriage. They had built a stable life together. None of that surprised me anymore. What surprised me was what came next. Sarah explained that Jason had tried several times to create distance from Rebecca, not because he disliked her, not because they were enemies, because he felt uncomfortable with how emotionally dependent she seemed to be on their connection. I read that sentence 3 times. Emotionally dependent. The words stayed with me long after the conversation ended. Sarah continued. She described occasions when Jason declined invitations, delayed responding to messages, or attempted to establish boundaries. Each time Rebecca eventually found another reason to reconnect. A birthday, a fundraiser, a reunion, a shared memory. Something always pulled the connection back into place. Jason feels guilty, Sarah wrote. He does not want to hurt her feelings. But he has told me more than once that he wishes she would move forward. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. For months I had been searching for hidden motives, hidden relationships, hidden betrayals. Instead, I found something much sadder. Rebecca was fighting to preserve something that even the other person no longer viewed the same way. The realization followed me home that evening. The sun had already set behind the mountains, leaving the neighborhood wrapped in soft darkness. Porch lights glowed along quiet streets. Inside our house, Rebecca sat on the couch scrolling through her tablet. She looked up when I entered. "How was your day?" she asked. It was a simple question. The kind married couples ask each other every day. Yet something felt different. For the first time in months, I answered honestly. "Productive." She smiled politely and returned to her screen. That was it. No follow-up. No curiosity. No interest in the details. A strange calm settled over me. Not disappointment. Acceptance. Because I finally understood that the distance between us was no longer caused by another person. It existed because we were living in entirely different emotional realities. Over the following weeks, I stopped trying to pull her back toward me. That sounds harsh, but it was not an act of punishment. It was an act of clarity. You cannot force someone to be present in a life they have already left emotionally. I focused on my company. I started spending more time with friends. I returned to hobbies I had gradually abandoned over the years. Saturday morning hikes, reading, long drives through the foothills outside the city. Little by little, I began rebuilding parts of myself that had nothing to do with my marriage. Interestingly, Rebecca noticed the change. One evening she asked why I seemed happier lately. The question almost made me laugh. Happier was not the right word. Stronger, maybe. More grounded. Less dependent on validation. But I simply smiled and said, "I have been keeping busy." She studied me for a moment before nodding. The conversation ended there. What she did not realize was that I had already started preparing for possibilities I once refused to consider. Not because I wanted the marriage to fail, because I finally accepted that it might. I met quietly with a financial advisor, then an attorney. Nothing dramatic. No secret schemes. No revenge plans. Just information. Adults preparing for uncertainty. Every meeting gave me a little more peace. Knowledge has a way of reducing fear. The future stopped feeling like a cliff and started feeling like a road. Around that same time, Rebecca became increasingly frustrated. Not with me, with life. Small inconveniences seemed to bother her more than usual. Work stress, family issues, minor disappointments. The fantasy she had protected for so many years no longer seemed capable of providing comfort the way it once had. And then, one cold November evening, she walked through the front door carrying news that would force both of us to confront reality far sooner than either of us expected. That evening, the temperature had dropped below 40 degrees. A cold wind rattled the bare branches outside our living room windows as I reviewed contracts at the dining room table. Rebecca came through the front door just after 7, carrying her coat over one arm. The moment I looked up, I knew something was wrong. Not catastrophic, not an emergency, just the look of someone whose expectations had collided with reality. She dropped her purse onto the counter and stood silently in the kitchen for several seconds. Normally, she would have filled the room with details about her day. Complaints about meetings, stories about coworkers, plans for the weekend. Instead, she stared at the refrigerator as if trying to organize her thoughts. "Everything okay?" I asked. She hesitated. "Jason is engaged." The words landed softly between us. I closed the folder in front of me and looked at her carefully. There it was. The news I already knew would eventually arrive. Sarah had mentioned it weeks earlier during our messages. Apparently, the official announcement had finally happened. Rebecca pulled out a chair and sat down. Heavily. "He proposed last weekend." I nodded once. "That is a big step." She laughed quietly, but there was no humor in it. "I guess it is." For a few moments, neither of us spoke. The house felt unusually quiet. Even the furnace seemed to pause. Then she started talking. At first it sounded casual. She wondered where the wedding might be held. She wondered how quickly they had planned everything. She wondered whether mutual friends already knew. But beneath every question I heard something else. Disappointment. Not because Jason was happy. Because his future no longer included a role she had imagined for herself. The realization became clearer with every sentence. "It just feels strange," she finally admitted. "We always thought we would be part of each other's lives." I studied her expression. "You still can be." She shook her head. "It will not be the same." No, it would not. Because reality rarely cooperates with nostalgia. People move forward. Relationships evolve. Priorities change. The versions of ourselves we preserve in memory eventually stop existing everywhere except our own minds. That was the truth Rebecca seemed unable to accept. Later that night, she sat alone on the back patio wrapped in a blanket despite the cold. Through the kitchen window, I could see her staring into the darkness. I remembered all the years I had spent worrying about losing her to another man. The irony was almost painful. There had never been another man. There had only been a memory. Around 10 o'clock, she came back inside. Her eyes looked tired. Older somehow. She poured a glass of water and stood beside the sink. "Do you ever regret anything?" she asked suddenly. The question caught me off guard. I considered it carefully. "Of course," I said. "Everyone does." She nodded slowly. "What if you chose the wrong life?" I looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Then eventually you have to stop comparing it to an imaginary one." The room went completely silent. For the first time in months, she looked directly at me. Not through me. Not around me. At me. Something shifted in her expression. Recognition, maybe. Or understanding. But it arrived too late. Because while Rebecca had been protecting a fantasy, I had been building a plan. The meetings with attorneys. The financial preparation. The quiet acceptance that our marriage might not survive. None of that disappeared because reality had finally reached her. Over the following days, she seemed different. More withdrawn. Less defensive whenever Jason's name surfaced. She stopped bringing him up altogether. Yet the distance between us remained. Some bridges can be repaired. Others collapse so gradually that nobody notices until the crossing is already gone. 1 week later, I received a call from my attorney confirming that every document I had requested was ready. I thanked him, hung up the phone, and stared out my office window at the snow beginning to fall over the city. The future I had spent months avoiding was no longer approaching. It had arrived. And that evening, when Rebecca came home and told me she wanted to talk about us, I already knew exactly what I was going to say. Rebecca stood near the kitchen island while snow drifted past the windows outside. The house felt unusually still. No television, no music, just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the sound of winter settling over the neighborhood. She looked nervous. I had not seen that expression on her face in a long time. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. I nodded and took a seat at the dining table. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she sat across from me and folded her hands together. "I know things have not been right between us," she said. "Not for a while." I listened without interrupting. She stared down at the table before continuing. "I think I spent too much time looking backward." The honesty surprised me. Months earlier, I would have waited desperately for words like those. Now they felt strangely distant, like hearing news about a place I no longer lived. "Maybe," I said. Rebecca looked up. Her eyes were tired. "I keep thinking about everything lately. About us. About the years we built together." She paused. "I do not think I appreciated them the way I should have." The room fell silent again. Outside, headlights moved slowly through the falling snow. Somewhere down the street, a garage door opened and closed. Ordinary sounds from ordinary lives. I remember realizing how calm I felt. Not angry, not vindicated, just calm. Rebecca took a slow breath. "I think I lost perspective." I nodded slightly. "I think you did too." Her eyes filled with disappointment. Not because I had been cruel, because I had been honest. The truth often hurts more when nobody raises their voice. For several seconds, she simply looked at me. Then she asked the question I knew was coming. "Is it too late?" Months earlier, I would have answered immediately. I would have fought for us, explained my feelings, tried to repair what was broken. But that version of me no longer existed. The man sitting across from her had spent months preparing himself for a different future. "I do not know if it is too late for you," I said quietly. "But it is too late for me." The words seemed to settle over the room like the snow outside. Rebecca looked away first. I could see the realization reaching her in real time. This was not a threat, not an argument, not an emotional reaction. It was a decision, one that had already been made. I opened the folder resting beside me on the table. The documents inside were neatly organized. Financial records, property information, legal paperwork. Months of preparation reduced to a few sheets of paper. I slid the folder toward her. She stared at it without touching it. "You already did all this?" she asked softly. "Yes." "How long?" I considered the question. "Long enough." She closed her eyes briefly. The answer told her everything she needed to know. This had not happened because of one conversation or one disappointment. It had happened because of years spent investing in a fantasy while neglecting reality. We talked for another hour that night, more honestly than we had spoken in years. There were no accusations, no dramatic revelations, just two people finally acknowledging truths that had existed for a very long time. Eventually, Rebecca asked about Jason. Not directly, just enough for me to understand the question beneath the question. I told her what I believed, that he had moved forward years ago, that he was building a life of his own, that the future she imagined had only existed in memory. She cried quietly after that, not because she lost him, because she finally understood she had lost time. And unlike money, careers, or relationships, time is the one thing nobody gets back. 6 months later, I was living in a townhouse on the other side of the city. The divorce had been respectful, difficult, but respectful. My company was growing. I spent weekends hiking again. I laughed more, slept better, felt lighter. One Saturday afternoon, I ran into a mutual friend who mentioned Rebecca. She was doing fine, he said. Adjusting, learning, moving forward. I genuinely hoped that was true, because despite everything, I never wanted her to suffer. I simply could not continue building a future with someone whose heart was always facing another direction. Looking back now, the lesson was never about jealousy. It was never about another man. It was about presence. The people who matter most deserve more than leftovers from yesterday. They deserve your attention today. And the moment someone starts treating a memory as more valuable than the life standing in front of them, they risk losing both. Rebecca eventually learned that lesson. So did I. The difference is that by the time she understood it, I had already begun writing the next chapter of my life.